The sun was setting over the small, sleepy town, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement behind Henry's diner. The air smelled faintly of grease and stale coffee, remnants of another long day spent flipping burgers and wiping down counters. Henry Parker wasn't a man who stood out in a crowd. He was average height, with graying hair that he kept neatly trimmed and a face lined by years of hard work and quiet solitude. His diner wasn't fancy, just a little place called Parker's Pit Stop, but it had been his life for as long as anyone could remember. As Henry finished cleaning up inside, stacking chairs on tables and turning off the neon open sign, he noticed something odd through the back window. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a shadow darting near the dumpster. At first he thought it might be a stray dog or maybe even raccoons rummaging through the trash again. But when he stepped closer to investigate, his heart sank. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a boy. The child moved quickly, his small hands sifting through discarded food wrappers and empty containers like he was searching for treasure. His clothes were dirty and patched together, clearly too big for his thin frame. The sight made Henry pause. He leaned against the doorframe, watching silently for a moment. What was this boy doing here? Why was he digging through garbage behind a diner? Henry felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him. Curiosity, frustration, and something else he couldn't quite name. Was it pity, anger, or just plain sadness? Whatever it was, it gnawed at him. Finally, unable to stay silent any longer, he pushed open the screen door and stepped outside. The metal hinges creaked loudly, startling the boy, who froze mid-motion, his eyes wide with fear. "Hey," Henry called out, his voice firm but not unkind. "What are you doing back here?" The boy hesitated, clutching a half-eaten sandwich, tightly in one hand. For a moment it looked like he might run, but instead he slowly turned to face Henry. His expression was a mixture of guilt and defiance, like he knew he'd been caught but wasn't about to apologize for it. The two of them stood there under the fading light of dusk, the world around them eerily still except for the distant hum of crickets. Henry crossed his arms over his chest, studying the boy more closely now. Despite the dirt smudged across his cheeks and the messy mop of dark hair falling into his eyes, there was something about him that tugged at Henry's heartstrings. Maybe it was the way his shoulders slumped slightly, as if carrying the weight of the world. Or perhaps it was the look in his eyes, a mix of desperation and determination that seemed far too mature for someone so young. "Well?" Henry prompted, after a beat of silence. "You gonna answer me, kid?" The boy swallowed hard, glancing around nervously before finally speaking. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, but what he said next would leave an indelible mark on Henry's soul. "Yes." Boy's lips parted, but no sound came out at first. He looked like a cornered animal, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Henry took a step closer, his boots crunching softly against the gravel-strewn ground. The noise seemed to startle the boy even more, and he instinctively took a step back, pressing himself closer to the grimy dumpster. His grip tightened around the sandwich he'd scavenged, as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. "Look," Henry said, softening his tone slightly. "I'm not gonna hurt you. I just want to know what you're doing here." He paused, letting the words hang in the cool evening air. The boy's eyes darted between Henry and the alleyway behind him, clearly calculating whether he could make a run for it. But something about Henry's calm demeanor must have reassured him, because instead of fleeing, the boy finally spoke. I didn't mean to cause trouble," the boy stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just hungry." Henry felt a pang of sympathy shoot through him, sharp and unexpected. He studied the boy's face again, his hollowed cheeks, the way his oversized jacket hung loosely off his bony shoulders, and realized this wasn't just some prank or youthful mischief. This was survival. A sinking feeling settled in Henry's stomach as he wondered how long the boy had been living like this, scrounging for scraps in dumpsters while the rest of the town went about their lives oblivious to his plight. "Hungry?" Henry echoed, his voice gentler now. "You don't have anyone feeding you at home?" At that question, the boy's gaze dropped to the ground. For a moment he didn't respond, and Henry thought maybe he wouldn't answer at all. But then, after a long pause, the boy shook his head almost imperceptibly. "No," he muttered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Not really." Henry frowned, his mind racing with questions. Who was this kid? Where did he come from? And why was he alone? Before he could ask anything else, though, the boy shifted uncomfortably, clearly uneasy under Henry's scrutiny. "I should go," the boy mumbled, taking another cautious step. "Backward. Wait," Henry said quickly, reaching out a hand to stop him, not to grab him but to show he meant no harm. "Hold on a second. You don't have to leave yet." He hesitated, unsure of what to say next. This situation was far outside his comfort zone. Running a diner was one thing. Dealing with a scared, starving child was entirely different. Still, he couldn't bring himself to turn away. Not when those big, frightened eyes were staring up at him like he was the last lifeline in a stormy sea. Henry glanced over his shoulder toward the diner, where warm lights still glowed faintly inside. "Come with me," he said finally, gesturing toward the door. "Let's get you something proper to eat, huh? Something better than whatever you found in there." He nodded toward the dumpster, trying to lighten the mood with a small smile. For a moment, the boy looked skeptical, his brow furrowing as if weighing the risks of trusting this stranger. Hunger won out, though, and after a hesitant beat, he gave a tiny nod. "Okay," he whispered, clutching the sandwich tighter as he followed Henry toward the door. As they walked side by side, Henry couldn't help but notice how small the boy seemed next to him. His sneakers were worn down to almost nothing, and his jeans had holes patched clumsily with mismatched fabric. Every detail painted a picture of hardship, and each one chipped away at Henry's resolve to remain detached. By the time they reached the doorway, Henry had already decided. This wasn't just going to be a quick meal. Whatever this boy needed, food, shelter, or simply someone to listen, Henry was determined to help. After all, everyone deserved a chance to feel safe, even if only for a little while. Outside the diner, the air was warm and smelled of fried onions and freshly baked bread. Henry led the boy to a booth near the window, where the last remnants of daylight filtered through the blinds, casting long stripes of gold across the worn tabletop. The boy slid into the seat cautiously, his movements deliberate, as if he expected someone to yell at him for being there. He kept his head down, clutching the half-eaten sandwich he'd brought with him like it was a prized possession. Henry disappeared behind the counter and returned moments later with a steaming plate of food, a cheeseburger, crispy fries, and a small bowl of tomato soup. He set it down in front of the boy, who stared at the meal wide-eyed as if unsure whether it was real. "Go ahead," Henry encouraged, his voice kind but firm. "Eat up. You look like you need it." The boy hesitated for a moment, then reached out tentatively, picking up a fry with trembling fingers. He popped it into his mouth, chewing slowly, savoring every bite as though he hadn't eaten in days. Watching him, Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't just hunger, it was desperation. After a few minutes of silence, broken only by the clink of utensils against the plate, Henry decided to try again. "So," he began gently, leaning against the edge of the booth. "What's your name?" The boy glanced up briefly before looking back down at his food. "Tommy," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Tommy," Henry repeated, nodding. "That's a good name." He paused, searching for the right words. "How old are you, Tommy?" 10, the boy replied after a beat, his eyes still fixed on the plate. Henry nodded again, doing the math in his head. 10 years old, barely more than a kid, and yet here he was fending for himself in ways most adults couldn't imagine. It didn't sit right with Henry, not one bit. "Where do you live, Tommy?" Henry asked carefully, trying not to sound too intrusive. The boy shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Around." "Around where?" Henry pressed, his curiosity outweighing his caution. This time, Tommy looked up, his expression guarded. "Just around," he said again, his tone firmer now, almost defensive. Henry sighed, sensing that pushing further might shut the boy down completely. Instead, he changed tactics. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," he said, softly. "But I'm here if you need help, okay? Whatever's going on, we can figure it out together." For a moment, Tommy seemed to consider this. His shoulders relaxed slightly and he stopped eating, letting the fork rest on the edge of the plate. Then, in a voice so quiet Henry almost missed it, Tommy spoke. "I'm just trying to help," he whispered, his words tumbling out like they'd been weighing him down for too long. Henry froze, the simplicity of the statement hitting him like a punch to the chest. Help? Help who? Himself? Someone else? The thought sent a chill running down Henry's spine. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Help who, Tommy?" he asked gently, his heart pounding in his ears. Tommy hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked with emotion. "My sister, she's little. She needs me." Those 5 words, "she's little, she needs me," cut straight through Henry. He sat back in his chair, stunned. Images flooded his mind. A younger sibling depending on this boy for survival, nights spent cold and hungry, days filled with fear and uncertainty. How had things gotten this bad? And why hadn't anyone noticed sooner? Before Henry could respond, Tommy suddenly pushed his plate away, his appetite gone. "I should go," he muttered, sliding out of the booth. Panic flickered in his eyes, as if he regretted saying too much. "No." "Wait!" Henry said quickly, standing up to block his path. "You don't have to leave, not yet." He softened his tone, adding, "Please, Tommy, let me help you." But the boy shook his head, backing toward the door. "I can't," he whispered, his voice trembling. And with that, he turned and bolted out of the diner, disappearing into the night as quickly as he'd come. Henry stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. The warmth of the diner felt suffocating now, replaced by a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. Those 5 words echoed in his mind, refusing to let go. "She's little. She needs me." Henry stood frozen in the doorway of the diner, watching as Tommy disappeared into the shadows of the alley. The cool night air brushed against his face, but it did nothing to ease the storm brewing inside him. His mind raced with questions. Who was this boy? Where did he live? And who was this little sister he spoke about with such urgency? The thought of a child trying to protect another child gnawed at Henry's conscience. It wasn't right. No kid should have to carry that kind of burden. For a moment he considered chasing after Tommy, but something stopped him. He knew from experience that forcing trust never worked. If he wanted to help, he'd have to do it carefully. So instead of running after the boy, Henry went back inside and began making plans. First, he packed up a bag of food, sandwiches, fruit, juice boxes, and a few snacks he thought would last a couple of days. Then, he grabbed an old flashlight from behind the counter and headed out into the night. The streets were quiet, the kind of silence that made every footstep echo louder than it should. Henry followed the direction Tommy had run, his eyes scanning the dark corners and abandoned buildings along the way. After nearly an hour of searching, he spotted the faint glow of a fire coming from a broken-down warehouse on the edge of town. As he approached cautiously, he saw Tommy sitting beside a makeshift campfire, huddled next to a tiny girl wrapped in a threadbare blanket. The sight hit Henry like a punch to the gut. The girl couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, her face pale and drawn, her hair tangled and matted. She clutched a stuffed rabbit tightly to her chest, its fur worn thin from years of use. Tommy sat close to her, shielding her from the chill of the night. When Henry stepped closer, both children looked up, their eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," Henry said quickly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just wanted to bring some food." He held out, the bag keeping his distance so they wouldn't feel threatened. Tommy hesitated, glancing between Henry and the bag before finally reaching out to take it. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry crouched down a few feet away, careful not to crowd them. "What's your sister's name?" he asked gently, trying to keep his tone light. "Lily," Tommy replied, brushing a strand of hair off her forehead. "She's sick." Henry's heart sank further. Sick? Out here? Without proper care, there was no telling how bad things could get for her. He glanced around the dilapidated space. They had nothing but a few blankets, a rusty metal can serving as their fire pit, and the clothes on their backs. How long had they been living like this? "Where are your parents?" Henry asked, though he already suspected the answer. Tommy shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "They left. A long time ago." "Left?" The word hung heavy in the air. Henry didn't press for details. Instead, he focused on what he could do right now. "Listen," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I own the diner down the road. You've already seen it. You know where it is. If you need anything, food, water, whatever, you come find me, okay? Anytime, day or night." Tommy nodded slowly, clutching the bag of food tighter. For the first time since meeting him, Henry saw a flicker of hope in the boy's eyes. It was small, fragile even, but it was there. "I'll try," Tommy whispered, looking down at Lily, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder. Henry stayed a little longer, making sure they had enough firewood to keep warm through the night. Before leaving, he promised himself and them that this wouldn't be the last time he checked on them. These kids needed help, and if no one else was going to step up, then it was up to him. The next morning, Henry woke up earlier than usual, his mind buzzing with thoughts of Tommy and Lily. He couldn't shake the image of the two children huddled together in that cold, abandoned warehouse. It wasn't just their physical state that haunted him. It was the weight of responsibility he saw in Tommy's eyes, the way he carried himself like a grown man despite being only 10 years old. Something had to change. These kids deserved more than scraps and shadows. They deserved safety, warmth, and a chance to be kids again. As he prepared for the day at the diner, Henry made a decision. He couldn't fix everything on his own, but he could start by reaching out to people who might know how to help. After opening the diner, he called Pastor Jenkins from the local church. The pastor was a kind man in his late 50s, known for his tireless work helping families in need. When Henry explained the situation, leaving out names and specifics to protect the children, the pastor didn't hesitate. "I'll see what we can do," Pastor Jenkins said firmly. "There are resources available, but it'll take some time to get things moving. In the meantime, keep an eye on them, Henry. They're lucky to have someone like you looking out for them." Those words stuck with Henry as he hung up the phone. Someone like him? He wasn't sure he deserved that kind of credit. All he'd done so far was feed them once and promise to check in. But maybe that was enough, for now. That evening, after closing the diner, Henry loaded up another bag of food and headed back to the warehouse. This time he brought extra blankets, a thermos of hot chocolate, and a small first aid kit he'd picked up earlier. When he arrived, Tommy was sitting outside, staring into the distance. His sister Lily lay curled up nearby, her breathing shallow but steady. "Hey," Henry said softly, setting the supplies down. "Brought you guys a few things." Tommy looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "You came back?" he said, almost as if he hadn't expected it. "Of course I did," Henry replied, giving him a reassuring smile. "Told you I would, didn't I?" For the first time, Tommy smiled. A real, genuine smile. And it lit up his whole face. "Thank you," he said, his voice steadier than before. Henry handed him the thermos. "Hot chocolate. Thought you and Lily might like something sweet tonight." Then gesturing toward the first aid kit, he added, "And this is for Lily. If she's still feeling sick, we should clean her up a bit. Can't have her getting worse." Tommy hesitated, but eventually nodded. Together, they worked quietly, tending to Lily while the fire crackled softly in the background. As they sat there, Henry noticed how protective Tommy was of his sister, constantly checking on her and adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. It was clear that despite everything, these two shared a bond stronger than most adults could imagine. When Lily finally stirred awake, Henry introduced himself gently, careful not to overwhelm her. She was shy at first, hiding behind Tommy. But when she saw the stuffed animal Henry had brought, a tiny teddy bear, he saw her guard drop slightly. "You can keep it," Henry told her with a wink. "It's brave, just like you." By the end of the night, both kids seemed a little lighter, a little less burdened. Before leaving, Henry knelt down to Tommy's level. "Listen, buddy," he said seriously. "I've got some people working on finding a better place for you and Lily. Until then, I'll keep bringing food and whatever else you need, okay? You're not alone in this anymore." Tommy's eyes glistened in the firelight, but he nodded, firmly. "Okay," he whispered. "Thank you for helping us." As Henry walked away, he felt a strange mix of emotions: hope, determination, and a deep sadness for the life these children had been forced to endure. But for the first time in years, he also felt purpose. Maybe he couldn't undo the past or fix the world, but he could make a difference for Tommy and Lily, and that was enough to keep him going. Over the next few weeks, Henry became a regular presence in Tommy and Lily's lives. Every evening after closing the diner, he'd make his way to the warehouse with food, fresh clothes, and whatever supplies he thought might help. The children began to trust him more with each visit, their initial fear slowly giving way to something resembling hope. Tommy still carried the weight of responsibility for his sister, but there was a newfound lightness in his step, a sense that for the first time in a long while someone else was sharing the load. One chilly afternoon, as Henry cleaned up the diner before heading out, Pastor Jenkins walked in. His expression was serious but kind, and he carried a folder under his arm. "Got some news," the pastor said, taking a seat at one of the booths. "We've found a foster family willing to take in Tommy and Lily. They're good people, experienced caregivers who've taken in other kids before." Henry felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed quickly by a pang of sadness. He knew this was the best outcome for the children, but the thought of saying goodbye left an ache in his chest. Still, he nodded firmly. "That's great news," he said, forcing a smile. "They deserve a real home." Pastor Jenkins placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. "You've done so much already, Henry. Without you stepping in, we might not have known about them until it was too late. You've given these kids a fighting chance." Henry shrugged modestly, though deep down he felt a flicker of pride. It wasn't often he allowed himself to feel like he'd made a difference, but this time, it was undeniable. "Just doing what anyone would do," he muttered, brushing off the compliment. The next day, Henry broke the news to Tommy and Lily. Both children listened quietly, their faces unreadable. When he finished explaining, Tommy frowned slightly. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "You'll go live with a nice family," Henry explained gently. "They'll take care of you, make sure you have everything you need. You won't have to worry about food or staying warm anymore." Lily clung to her brother's arm, her big eyes filled with questions. "Will you come too?" she asked softly, looking up at Henry. Henry's heart twisted. He crouched down to her level, smiling warmly despite the lump in his throat. "I can't come with you, sweetheart, but I promise I'll visit whenever I can. You'll never be far from my thoughts." Tommy studied Henry for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Thank you for everything." The day they left, Henry met the foster parents at the warehouse. They were kind-looking people with gentle smiles and open arms. As Tommy and Lily gathered their meager belongings, a blanket, a stuffed rabbit, and the teddy bear Henry had given Lily, Henry fought back tears. When it came time to say goodbye, Lily ran to him and threw her tiny arms around his neck. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice muffled against his jacket. Henry hugged her tightly, blinking rapidly to clear his vision. "Take care of your brother, okay? And remember, you're stronger than you think." When it was Tommy's turn, the boy hesitated, then stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Henry in a fierce hug. "Thank you for helping us," Tommy murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't forget you." "I won't forget you either, buddy," Henry replied, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. "Now go on. Start your new life." As the car drove away, Henry stood in the empty alley, watching until it disappeared around the corner. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't lonely. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a reminder that even small acts of kindness could ripple outward, changing lives in ways he might never fully understand. And as he turned to head back to the diner, he realized something important. Helping others didn't just change their lives, it changed his too. Weeks turned into months, and life at the diner settled back into its usual rhythm. The days were long, filled with sizzling grills, clinking plates, and the hum of conversation from customers passing through. But for Henry, there was a quiet emptiness that lingered in the corners of his mind. Tommy and Lily's absence left a void he hadn't expected. He often found himself glancing toward the alley behind the diner, half expecting to see Tommy digging through the trash again, or worse, imagining what might have happened if he'd never noticed the boy that fateful evening. Then one crisp autumn morning, as Henry flipped burgers during the breakfast rush, the bell above the door jingled softly. He glanced up instinctively but didn't think much of it, until he saw who walked in. It was Tommy, now cleaner and healthier looking than the last time Henry had seen him. His hair was neatly trimmed, his clothes fit properly, and there was color in his cheeks that hadn't been there before. Beside him stood Lily, clutching her stuffed rabbit and holding tightly to her brother's hand. Her face lit up when she spotted Henry behind the counter. "Henry!" she exclaimed, running toward him with uncontainable excitement. Henry's heart swelled as he stepped out from behind the grill to greet them. "Well, look who's here," he said, bending down to give Lily a warm hug. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see you two again." "We promised we'd visit," Tommy reminded him, smiling shyly. "And we wanted to show you something." Curious, Henry ushered them to a booth near the window. As they sat down, Tommy pulled an envelope from his backpack and handed it to Henry. Inside was a handwritten letter folded neatly alongside a colorful drawing. The picture depicted the diner, complete with stick figures standing outside. One tall figure labeled Henry, and two smaller ones labeled Tommy and Lily. Above the scene, bold letters spelled out, "Thank you for saving us." Henry felt his throat tighten as he read the note aloud. "Dear Henry, thank you for helping us when no one else would. Because of you, we have a home now, and people who care about us. We'll never forget what you did for us. Love, Tommy and Lily." Tears welled up in Henry's eyes as he looked at the siblings, overwhelmed by their gratitude. This is amazing," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, we did," Tommy insisted earnestly. "You saved us. If you hadn't helped, I don't know where we'd be right now." Henry shook his head, brushing away a tear with the back of his hand. "No, Tommy, you saved yourselves. All I did was lend a hand. The real heroes are you two, for sticking together, for fighting so hard to keep each other safe." The three of them spent the next hour talking and laughing, catching up on everything that had happened since the children moved in with their foster family. Tommy shared stories about school, where he was finally learning to read without worrying, about being hungry or tired. Lily proudly showed off a shiny gold star sticker she'd earned for good behavior in class. Watching them, Henry couldn't help but marvel at how much they'd changed. In just a few short months, they seemed like entirely different kids. Before they left, Henry knelt down to Lily's level, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Remember what I told you?" he asked softly. "You're stronger than you think." She nodded enthusiastically, her grin lighting up the room. "And so are you, Henry." As they walked out the door, waving goodbye, Henry stood rooted to the spot, watching until they disappeared from view. For the rest of the day, he couldn't stop smiling. That simple visit had reminded him why he'd opened the diner in the first place, not just to serve meals, but to make a difference, however small, in the lives of others. From that moment on, Henry vowed to keep looking out for people like Tommy and Lily. Life wasn't perfect, and the world was still full of struggles, but sometimes all it took was one act of kindness to remind someone they weren't alone. And that was a lesson Henry knew he'd carry with him forever. Months passed, and the diner became busier than ever. Word had spread about Henry's kindness, Not just because of the food he served, but because of the way he treated everyone who walked through the door with respect and care. Strangers turned into regulars, and regulars became friends. It wasn't unusual for customers to linger after their meals, sharing stories or simply enjoying the warmth of the place. The once solitary Henry found himself surrounded by a community he hadn't realized he'd been missing. But even as life moved forward, Tommy and Lily remained close to his heart. Their visit had left an indelible mark on him, a reminder that no act of kindness was ever wasted. Every time the bell above the diner door jingled, part of him hoped it might be the siblings returning for another visit. And though they didn't come often, their letters arrived regularly, filled with updates about school, new friends, and the little adventures they were having in their foster home. Each envelope brought a smile to Henry's face and renewed his belief in second chances. One chilly winter evening, as Henry closed up the diner, he paused to look out the window at the empty alley behind the building. Memories of that night, the boy digging through the trash, the 5 heartbreaking words, the bond that grew from such humble beginnings, flooded his mind. He thought about how far Tommy and Lily had come since then. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. And while Henry knew he couldn't take all the credit, he also knew he'd played a part in giving them a chance at a better life. That realization changed something inside him. For years, Henry had gone through the motions, content to keep his head down and focus on getting by. But meeting Tommy and Lily had awakened something deeper, a desire to do more, to give back in ways he hadn't considered before. Inspired by their resilience, Henry started volunteering at the local shelter on weekends, serving meals and listening to the stories of others who were struggling. He began partnering with Pastor Jenkins to organize food drives and fundraisers, using the diner as a hub for donations. Slowly but surely, Henry transformed not only his own life but the lives of those around him. One day, as he flipped pancakes during the morning rush, a young woman approached the counter holding a steaming cup of coffee. She introduced herself as Sarah, a social worker assigned to Tommy and Lily's case. "I wanted to thank you," she said warmly. "Those kids talk about you all the time. You've made such a difference in their lives and mine too." Henry chuckled softly, scratching the back of his neck. "Just doing what anyone would do," he replied humbly. Sarah shook her head. "No, not everyone would. What you did, it takes courage and compassion. Don't underestimate the impact you've had." Her words stayed with him long after she left. Courage? Compassion? Those weren't traits Henry associated with himself. Yet, as he looked around the diner, at the laughter, the conversations, the sense of belonging, he realized she was right. By opening his heart to 2 scared children, he'd opened it to the world. As the seasons changed and years went by, Henry continued living his life with purpose. The diner remained a cornerstone of the community, a place where people could find more than just a meal. They could find hope. And whenever doubt crept in, Henry remembered Tommy's words. "Thank you for helping us." In the end, it wasn't about grand gestures or heroic feats. Sometimes it was the smallest acts of kindness, a plate of food, a listening ear, a promise kept, that made the biggest difference. Henry had learned that lesson the hard way, but it had changed him forever. And so every time he saw someone in need, he didn't hesitate to reach out. Because deep down, he knew that everyone deserved a chance to feel safe, loved, and valued. Even if it started with just 5 simple words.